called the talk The Divide Itself, and it should be pretty obvious why, in a few minutes, why I'm calling it that. And it's a quite grandiose talk I'm doing today. The subtitle is How a Better Understanding of the Human Mind Could Transform Society. Now, what I'm going to be talking about, I'm saying that we're faced with a number of major challenges. The relationship with the planet in terms of climate change, sustainability, the increasing demand for finite resources, and our relationship with each other in terms of prejudice, inequality, and conflict. Now, I want to suggest that some new ideas in psychology may help us reframe both sets of challenges and thereby act more effectively. Now, I think there's genuine frustration that these issues of climate change and racism have proven to be so intractable. World leaders, economists, social scientists, the commercial sector have all offered solutions that have failed. So why is this? Now, I'm going to suggest that it's us that's the problem and how we think and act. The first time I showed that slide with the US, people thought I was blaming the United States for the problem. I'm going to suggest it's the US that's the problem, which would have been a bit simpler. So it's a bit of a more complicated one. It's us, it's human beings. Okay. Firstly, climate change. Well, the point about climate change, the scientific evidence is overwhelming. It's rare to find anything in which there is such scientific consensus about as climate change. And the Stern Review, 2006, nearly 10 years ago, said that climate change threatens the basic elements of life for people around the world. The IPCC report in 2014 says a rise in global temperature will have severe and widespread impacts, major risks to global food production, and more extreme fluctuations in weather, including droughts, flooding, and storms. But of course, there's something else about climate change, as Stern pointed out. Human activities are a major driver of this rapid change in our climate, particularly patterns of consumption and energy use, driven by consumer demand for higher standards of living. So it's not just that there's a problem that we're contributing to. Now, some people have got the message. Some governments, NGOs, and leading multinationals have got the message. Now, I'm going to just focus on one because I think they've taken the lead in some respects on this. Unilever, for example. Unilever, for those of you who don't know, the turnover of Unilever is about 40 billion a year. Its products are sold in 190 countries. 2 billion times a day, somebody uses one of their products. So they see, in some sense, the responsibility of their position for driving consumer demand. Of course, their KPIs are primarily financial. They're looking for growth. But as I heard the chair of Unilever say, there's no profit from a dead planet. Okay? So they say that business must be part of the solution. And in order to live within the natural limits of the planet, we will have to decouple growth from environmental impact. So they also put a key performance indicator, which was they wanted to halve the greenhouse gas impacts of their products across the life cycle by 2020. So what did they do? They reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing chain, reduced deforestation, more environmentally friendly sourcing of raw materials, doubled their use of renewable energy, produced concentrated liquids and powders, reduced greenhouse gas emissions from transport and refrigeration, reduced employee travel. They did all of that. And what was the end result of that? Their greenhouse gas footprint impact per consumer has increased by around 5% since 2010. So they did everything they could, and it still went up. And their conclusion was, we have made good progress in those areas under our control, but the big challenges are those areas not under our direct control, like consumer behaviour. Now, I'm a psychologist, so I want to understand this problem. How are we going to do something if people out there are trying to do something on our behalf and we're not responding appropriately? Now, of course, the point about climate change is psychologically, it's a really interesting phenomenon for all kinds of reasons. The effects of climate change are less personal. Brighton yesterday was nice and sunny, and you thought maybe the climate is changing. I went for a run on the promenade this morning. It was chilly. So I thought, no, I didn't think, of course, but some people would have thought, maybe not. So it's less personal. It's primarily about future generations. It's very easy to shift responsibility when it comes to climate change, and we did an experiment a couple of years ago where we took Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, and played it to people. And there's a bit of Inconvenient Truth, which is about power stations in China. And once people watch that bit of film, and then you ask them about their personal responsibility for climate change, it seemed to drop. As soon as you remind people of things happening elsewhere, they take less responsibility for what's going on. There seems to be some uncertainty about the time course of climate change, but of course there are powerful lobbies behind this uncertainty. Just as there were powerful lobbies about the effects of tobacco on cancer from the 1950s onwards. And we now know that the tobacco industry was funding academics to come up with counter evidence. I remember years ago hearing one of Britain's foremost psychologists saying that smoking doesn't cause cancer. His argument was that certain personalities are prone to cancer and certain personalities are prone to smoke, and that there was an artifact in the research. Now, it always struck me as being an extraordinary argument, and later we discovered that this scientist was being paid £1 million by the tobacco industry to investigate the possible role of personality as a confounding variable. Climate change is complicated. We know that. And there's the emotional valence of global warming. Global warming sounds good. If you're from the UK, chilly country, it sounds good. A little bit of warming is okay. Maybe it's too catastrophic to contemplate, and we're doing some work on optimism at the moment and why optimistic people never even see the messages for climate change. So there's lots of reasons why it's kind of complicated. So it's hard, but it's not impossible if we can read people better and design better initiatives. So step one of doing something about climate change as a psychologist is trying to understand the mind of the consumer, to understand what's possible and what's not. We need to understand their motives and intentions. Can they change their patterns of consumption? Can they break their habits and routines? We need to understand all that. Now, this mind reading might seem to be difficult, but a lot of people think it's possible. I'm going to argue in this talk that it's more difficult than it might appear because consumers don't have a mind. They have two. They've got two distinct cognitive systems, each with its own properties and mode of operation, and one of these isn't open to introspection. But some great mind readers have tried in the past. So Terry Leahy at the time was the CEO of Tesco, a multinational, huge in the UK. He said that consumers want to do more in the fight against climate change if only we can make it easier and more affordable. So he was reading the mind of consumers. He said they want to do more. Market research seemed to support his conclusion. So, for example, 70% of people agree that if there is no change in the world, we will soon experience a major environmental crisis. 78% say that they are prepared to change their behaviour to help limit climate change. The view was shared by government. DEFRA, which is the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, also did a bit of mind reading. They said, many people are willing to do more to limit their environmental impact. How could they know that? How could they read the minds of consumers? They were telling us that consumers were ready to change. But on the basis of that bit of mind reading, Tesco introduced this carbon footprint information on products. And the idea behind this was that consumers, when they went to supermarkets, were meant to look at products, choose the low carbon alternative, and things would be okay. And this was a huge change in the behaviour of a company like Tesco. So the idea was it was meant to drive a green revolution. It's what consumers said they wanted, which was information. It had worked with health information on food. They wanted to label all 70,000 products. It took several months to calculate the footprint of each one. It was validated by the Independent Carbon Trust, and consumers should now choose the low carbon footprint alternative. But how did they behave? Well, they didn't do what the supermarket thought. And this is something else they didn't do. One experiment, we showed people products with carbon footprint on them, and we tracked their eyes. So this is the first video that's not working, so I'll have to describe what happens. What you would have seen is a little black fly, which is the eye fixations, the unconscious eye movements, flitting around the product. Have a guess what they didn't look at. What do you think they looked at? What didn't they look at? When people look at products, do they fixate first on the carbon footprint? Price. What else? The colour, the brand, the value, things they know. They look at all those things. And what they don't look at is the carbon footprint of the carbon footprint information. And oddly, Tesco hadn't checked whether people would actually fixate on that information before they spent millions labelling products with carbon footprint. So the information was there. We know it had worked with fat content on food. We know it obviously works with advertising and value, but when you put carbon footprint on, they don't look at the information, and they weren't choosing the low carbon alternatives. But the question is, was this mind reading ever justified? Now, this is the really interesting psychological question. If we're going to do something about climate change, and if we have to read consumers, what are we going to base that kind of strategy on? Now, of course, the key concept in psychology, probably the central concept underpinning psychology, especially social psychology, is the concept of the attitude. And an attitude is a mental and neural state of readiness, organized through experience, exerting a directive or dynamic influence upon the individual's response to all objects and situations with which it's related. And that quote is the classic quote from Gordon Allport in 1935. And it's kind of defined psychology for the last 80 years, really. It's the concept of an attitude. It's a state of readiness in which you will act in a particular way, and we can measure that. Now, the big psychological question and the big philosophical question is, how can we measure people's readiness to act? How can we work out what they will do and what they won't do? Now, the way we normally do it in social psychology is you simply ask people to report their attitude. I ask you about your attitude to smoking, to Brighton, to conferences, to anything. You introspect and you tell me what it is. And that looks really straightforward. And this, as a popular way of measuring attitudes, was developed by Gordon Allport following a particular personal experience. And if anyone's ever read Gordon Allport's autobiography, there's the most extraordinary story in that book about what happened to Allport as a young graduate. As a young graduate, he went to visit Freud in Vienna. He was 21, 22 at the time. And Gordon Allport was very shy. And Freud then was incredibly famous. And he got the tram out to Freud's place of work. And when he got there, Freud, being a psychoanalyst, they used silence a lot. And Freud was quite silent when he met Allport. And Allport, being a shy boy, was very embarrassed by the silence and decided to fill the silence by telling him a story of something he had observed. And what he had observed was, on the tram on the way out, he had seen this very well-dressed lady with her young son, and this gentleman got on the tram and tried to sit beside the boy, and the boy threw a tantrum because he didn't want this man to sit beside him because he thought he was dirty. And Allport said he thought the boy's phobia came from the mother. And he was just doing it as a way of, this is something I've observed. Hey, it's a bit like something I've observed over breakfast this morning. Let's start with an anecdote. He was just an anecdote. So Freud looked at him and said, was that little boy obsessed with dirt? Was that boy you? And Allport couldn't believe it. He'd tried to psychoanalyze him. What Freud was suggesting, that he had noticed all of this because Allport himself was obsessed with dirt. And the reason he was obsessed with dirt was he'd got little secrets. Now, the extraordinary thing about this story is that psychoanalysts since that time have suggested that he had little secrets because he had suggested to Freud that he was sufficiently important that Freud should see him. And he was a dirty little boy. But of course, Allport's response to this was what most of us would be, which is, how dare he? How dare he try to psychoanalyze me? I was just filling the time. This wasn't deserving of psychoanalysis. And it's really interesting that up to that point, Allport had talked about the unconscious. After that, he never talked about it again. He talked about psychoanalytic excess. And he moved straight into trying to measure attitudes by asking people to report them, not trying to delve into the unconscious. So he had said, often an attitude seemed to have no representation in consciousness other than a vague sense of need or some indefinite or unanalyzable feeling of doubt, assent, conviction, effort, or familiarity. He recognized at one point that attitudes could be unconscious, but following what Freud did to him, it was all to do with what people could report. Now, the question I'm going to put to you today is, can we build a science of the unconscious? Can we measure these vague senses of doubt? And can we resurrect the unconscious as being a core driver of human action? Now, one impetus for this whole thing is this growing recognition that there are now two systems of the human mind, and a lot of attention has been given to Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist's recent book. Kahneman gets a lot of attention because, of course, he won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. And Kahneman argues that human beings seem to have two systems of thought. One system of thought is automatic, fast, impulsive, unintended, and unconscious. And one system is intentional, slow, controlled, reflective, and conscious. Now, let me just illustrate the two systems very quickly. Okay, how do we read people's emotions? Okay, so I'm going to get you to do some emotion reading, and I want to see how you do it. Now, there are no tricks in this. I'm going to show you 6 very simple and very old pictures of people displaying emotions. They are not blend emotions. They are nothing too complicated. The first time I showed these slides, I showed one of the pictures, and I said, "What emotion?" And someone said, "Constipation." And I said, "Constipation isn't really an emotion." And I was wondering how they knew what their face might look like. So it almost asked too many questions. So the reason I've said there are 6 basic emotions is because no constipation, no blends, nothing too complicated, but just shout out as quickly as you know what the emotion is, okay? As quickly as you can. Happiness, good. Fear. Anyone different from fear? Yeah, fear and surprise. Put your hand up for surprise. Yeah, fear and surprise are often confused. It is fear, but fear and surprise are often confused. Woo! That's surprise. Well, it's more of it, yeah. Anger. Disgust. It's pretty easy, right? No, it didn't take you days. Fear and surprise are often confused. When the chairs were being banged out earlier, everyone looked around. Nobody thought, "There's a sound. Let me reflect on that sound." Yes, I've thought about it now. Let me look consciously around. Nobody did that. We all just turned. Bread and butter. Yeah, we don't think bread and margarine, bread and marmalade. Oh, what could it be? Okay, 2 and 2. Yeah. So these are all pretty conscious, rational decisions. Right. A volunteer for the next one. Anyone? Not shy? Just anyone? Well, I'll not pick it. You do it. Okay, right. So here's a slightly different one, okay? 17 times 24.
34, 42, 100. No.
17 times 20. Go ahead. Take as long as you like. Now, that's a little bit different, isn't it? That's not like the emotion reading. So 17 fours is 68. 8 carry 6. 17 twos 34. Add 6. 4 away. Takes you a while, right? So my guess, whatever you're doing now is conscious, controlled, reflective, intentional, and slow. And that's a kind of system 2 thinking. It's a kind of logical, rational kind of thinking. So if you're looking for a friend in the audience, you think, "Oh, where's so-and-so?" And you're looking for so-and-so. That's conscious and controlled. Tell someone your phone number. You have to remember it. Conscious and controlled. Check out the validity of a complex logical argument. Conscious and controlled. They're all system 2. So what Kahneman's saying, look, we've got 2 systems with the human mind. System 1 is the automatic and unconscious system. System 2 is this conscious and controlled system. And you might think, well, that's pretty obvious. But what I want to think is, what is the implications of that for trying to read the minds of human beings? If we've got an automatic system, what's the long-term legacy implications of that? And also, this is a really interesting question, which is, what's the relationship between those 2 systems like? Now, what Kahneman says is something like this. He says that System 1 continuously generates suggestions for System 2. System 1 is this quick associative system. It's always working. It's always making suggestions. If endorsed by System 2, they turn into voluntary actions. When System 1 runs into difficulties and calls on System 2 for more detailed processing, and when System 1 has no answer, System 2 is mobilized. So we have a conscious system which is on hand, but System 1 does as much as it can. And that all kind of makes sense. But, could I have a volunteer for this one? Here's another little mathematical problem. So, a bat and a ball cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Just shout out. Shout out when you know the answer. 10p. Put your hand up for 10p. Some people didn't put the hand up. Do you think 10p? Who said 5p? 5p is correct. So the ball costs £1 more than. How much does the ball cost? Do you see? Because if it was £1 and 10p, it wouldn't be £1 more, it'd be 90p more. So 5p is correct. Are you okay? No, the extraordinary thing is a quick intelligence test this time in the morning. This isn't what we're hoping for. Okay, now people tend not to check, and more than 80% of university students give the wrong answer. System 2, which is the logical system, endorsed an intuitive answer that it could have rejected with a small investment of effort. And what Kahneman says, System 2, the logical, rational system, can be very lazy. According to Kahneman, this judgment is harsh but not unfair. You could have checked, but you didn't. It just seemed right, so you went with it. And that's your System 1 kind of response. System 1, Kahneman characterizes as a workaholic. System 2 is the slow one. Okay, so this is System 1 working now. Look at the following two words. Bananas, vomit. Bananas, vomit. Nice, Jeffrey, yeah. So, right. So what happened? This is the associative way the System 1 works. You experience unpleasant images and feelings. Anyone enjoy that? Bananas, vomit? Anyone think, wow, I will come again to hear you talk. That's a great experience. Your mind assumed a causal connection between the two words. If I offered you a banana now, you'd say, no, thank you, I'll leave it till later. And the state of your memory has changed. So if I give you a little structure like this to fill in, sick, you'd shout sick. Try it at Christmas time. I tried it with my son at Christmas. Have a guess what he said? Sock or sack. He wasn't thinking vomit and sickness. He was thinking present, sock, sack. Yeah. So you're more likely to recognize objects and concepts associated with vomit, that's priming, and recognize words associated with bananas. You want to survive. The associative machine's helping us survive. It's just seen something it doesn't like, and now you're primed to think of other things. And then actions, not just thoughts, can be primed by events of which you're not aware. Now I was going to show you a brilliant little video, which unfortunately isn't playing, and I blame myself. Now what this video was, just to show the effects of priming, was what happens if you prime people with the smell of lemon. And the idea is that lemon smell is associated with, have a guess what it's associated with in our minds. Fresh, cleaning, yeah? So what we did was, we did a very simple experiment, got people in to wait for an experiment, it's called the waiting room technique, and we gave them a crumbly biscuit. And it's been found in the past, if you prime people with the smell of lemon, and you ask them their plans for the day after they've left the experiment, have a guess what they list in terms of their plans when they get back to their student accommodation. Guess what they say they're going to do? Clean. I'm going to clean. It's bizarre. And with this very simple experiment, we give them a biscuit to eat. It's a very funny video. And anyone who wants to see it, I'll have the laptop after the talk, and you can come along, I'll just play the tape to you. It's very funny to watch. We give her a biscuit to eat. Well, first of all, she turned up for an experiment. We said the experiment's not ready yet. So we said, apologies, here's a biscuit. And she said, oh, fantastic. And she's hungry. She's like, wants the biscuit. But it's very, very crumbly. And an assistant of mine sprays the room with lemon. So it's been sprayed with lemon. She gets the biscuit. And she starts eating it very hungrily. And she makes a mess. And she gathers it all up. And the people who were sprayed with lemon tended to clean up after themselves. The ones who weren't sprayed with lemon, they just knocked it on the floor. It's quite funny to watch, so I'll play the video, but I do apologize. Okay, so the human mind's comprised of two systems that work on different principles. The interaction between the two is critical. One system is conscious, and we think reflects our true self. So that's the rational, logical self that we are. The other is unconscious. This is the automatic system and hidden from us, and it's a bit of a workaholic. Now, my question is this, in terms of the big questions we're facing, like the climate change, inequality, racism, prejudice, how do these associations work across time? How do they shape our attitudes and behaviour? And could we have unconscious, implicit attitudes based on this associative activation over time? Now, it was unclear how you might measure them until maybe 17 years ago, when somebody said, look, we can measure associations by looking at simply speed of reaction. And they devised something called the implicit association test. And it's simply looking at the speed with which you can associate certain concepts with the concepts of good and bad. It's as simple as that. If you've got positive associations with something, you can more quickly respond when it's paired with something which reflects the evaluative concept good. And the way it's done is you show images like this, which is a low energy light bulb. First of all, people categorize it as low or high carbon. You see words you categorize as good or bad. And then you have to categorize the light bulb as either good or high carbon, or good or low carbon. Now, if you have positive implicit associations towards low carbon, that is much easier than the previous one, than that. And it simply produces something called a D-score, which is a reaction time difference. So when you're measuring attitudes this way, you're not asking people to report anything, you're simply measuring speed of response. Now you end up with this very, very simple little measure. And what's interesting is that that measure plus the normal measure of attitude, the self-report one, both predict behaviour in different domains. But this IAT is a better predictor of spontaneous behaviour when behaviour is under cognitive, emotional, or time pressure. When people are under any kind of time pressure, or trying to remember stuff, or under any emotional pressure, this associative measure seems to be a much better predictor of their behaviour. And for the things I'm interested in, it seems to be a much, much better predictor of behaviour in sensitive domains, including race and environment. Now let me just show you some data on this. If you measure people's attitudes to high and low carbon, and you ask them to report it in the normal way, so these are explicit attitudes, you tend to get something that looks like this. 5 means I strongly prefer low carbon. 4 means prefer low carbon. 3 means kind of neutral. 2, slight preference to high carbon. 1 is a stronger preference to high carbon. And nearly everyone's distributed that way. Everyone says they prefer low carbon products, lifestyles, etc. But when we use the IAT to measure apparent preference to high and low carbon, you end up with something really different. The further to the right is the higher the preference to low carbon. Going towards the left is a stronger preference to high carbon. And it looks completely different. So in other words, this reaction time measure is telling us something completely different to what people themselves are reporting. Now the question is, does that have any behavioural implications? Does it have any implications for what we need to do as a society or a set of nations? Now this is, to me, it's a really interesting psychological question. A couple of points to begin with. There's no correlation at all in the domain of the environmental issues in terms of people's measures on the two things. If people report that they really care about low carbon and you measure this D-score, there's no statistical association. And it looks as if the two things are dissociated. And it looks as if there are many surface greens in society who report a very positive attitude to low carbon, but actually unconsciously hold a positive implicit attitude to high carbon. And to me, this is one of the biggest contemporary psychological challenges. Can we try to understand the psychology of such individuals? Because it may be critical to a lot of what we're trying to do. These sets of people may be very common. They haven't been identified as a group so far, because after all, they report that they prefer low carbon products. Now, can we identify these at all? Well, one way I've tried to do this is by analysing how people talk about certain things and microanalyse their behaviour. Now, one thing that I'm really interested in, I'm going to have to set this down for a second, are these weird things that people do when they talk. They make spontaneous hand movements. And we've often thought that these spontaneous hand movements are a form of body language. And we always think that body language does something different from language. Language tells us about the world of ideas, abstraction, tells us about the world. Body language is meant to be about relationships, attitudes, and that kind of thing. But these hand movements seem very odd. First of all, they are spontaneous. When you make a hand movement and then you stop someone, as I've done many times, and say, could you just tell me what you've just done with your hands? They say, I have no idea. It's not like doing this, because they're kind of different. These are conscious translations of verbal language into movement. The kind of spontaneous movements, it's very hard to repeat. This is something for the rest of the conference. Every time you have an interesting conversation with someone, just stop them and say, just tell me what you've done with your hands, please. if you do television at all, as I'm sure some of you will have done, the first thing they tell you is, don't wave your hands so much. And I am a bit of a hand waver. So they said to me when I first presented for TV, they said, put your hands in your pocket if you can't stop. So I put my hands in my pocket. I'll have to show you this. But I kept doing it. That wasn't enough to stop the hand movements. And I've got some great videos of people talking where they're talking and their hands are below a desk and they're still doing it. And if you've ever noticed anyone on the telephone, the hand that's free, their friend might be miles away, but they're still gesturing away. So these are odd things that people do. They're multidimensional. There's lots of dimensions in them. They're meaningful. And they're meaningful because I've done lots of experiments where I've played these movements to people and asked them what's in the gesture. So, for example, if I'm talking about someone driving somewhere and people can see the gesture and I say, how fast were they driving? Which direction were they driving in? All of this information is being picked up in the hand movement and communicated to people. So they're meaningful and yet they're unconscious and therefore less open to editorial control. And it's really interesting that one of the main behavioral indicators of deception, by the way, is that when people are lying, the first thing they do is what? What do you think they do? How do you tell someone's lying? What do they do behaviorally? Joe, what do they do? What do shifty people do?
Their eyes.
It's their eyes. We always think it's the eyes. They won't look at you in the eyes. They won't look, or they blink too much, or they're not blinking enough. They're doing something with the eyes. But has anyone ever told a lie? No, I wanted the one liar to say, I have never told a lie. How dare you? How dare you say that everyone's told a lie? Of course, yeah. I like who said of course. Perfect. Yeah, that's the. I've never heard that answer before. Of course. We always think it's the eyes, but of course, if we've ever told a lie, we know. Even with your mum, Joe. Even when you're lying to your mum, you know to keep the eye movements right. So the best behavioral indicator of deception, interestingly, is people inhibit their hand movements. They gesture much less. They inhibit their movements for a very good reason, because if they don't, these gestures sometimes, because they're not under editorial control, will be discrepant with what they're saying in their speech. And we did a study recently looking at what happens to gestural movement when people are telling lies. And all kinds of interesting things happen. If they do gesture, because sometimes we have to, it's really noticeable if you don't gesture. So if you do gesture, the gestures get shorter. And the most telltale sign of all is when we do a gesture, there's a thing at the end of the gesture called the post-stroke hold. We've made the meaningful bit of the gesture, then the gesture sits momentarily in a particular place before we pull it back. And when we are lying, when we do the post-stroke hold, it's instantaneous. We do the gesture and get the hand away immediately. So it's very odd. So I've been interested in deception for a long time. But suddenly I thought, well, what happens to people who are surface greens? What happens to people who tell me they really care about the environment, but I've measured their unconscious implicit attitude, and I know they don't care? Are there any telltale signs in their gesture? So I did a little study where I interviewed people talking about choices. I'm just going to show you two little clips. One person is talking about her choices in the supermarket, and she's saying if you've got high carbon and low carbon, you would choose the low carbon. That's what she says. And the first lady I'm going to play, I've measured her explicit attitude, and she says she cares about the environment. I've measured her unconscious attitude. She does care about the environment, so watch her. The second lady says she cares about the environment. I've measured her unconscious attitude. She doesn't. And watch her gestural movement, okay?
Yeah, if it was like really high and something was really low, if it was the same product, but there was a difference in price, then I'd probably still feel really guilty about buying the high carbon one, so I'd buy the low.
Okay, do you see that? She's saying high and low. I feel guilty about buying the high, so I'd buy the low. And she located the low in the gestural space, and she reached for that place. And what we found was people whose explicit and implicit attitudes converged, that's what they did. Now watch the next person. She says she cares, but our measures say she probably doesn't.
So they were next to each other, and it was quite obvious one was good and one was bad, and you'd go for the good one.
She says then you go for the good one, she's reaching for the bad one. It's absolutely weird. And we never found that gesture-speech mismatch with anyone who had implicit and explicit attitudes that converged. She's reaching for the wrong one. It's quite bizarre. And it's a bit like, anyway, so, and there were no examples of that when people, explicit and implicit attitudes converged. So the question is it surprising? Is it surprising? We go through life and we think we need to do something about the environment, and yet some of us seem to have implicit attitudes which are conflicting. Now I'm going to argue that perhaps it's not that surprising, because we've grown up 35 different countries, but most countries are putting huge emphasis on particular lifestyles, aspirational lifestyles connected with our high carbon lifestyles. You see the point I'm making, which is, there's been years of people being bombarded with messages about what success and status in society consists of. And yet we all recognize that such lifestyles are not sustainable. So it looks as if the way we cope with that is to split. Our rational self thinks one thing, our automatic self thinks something else. And it's that division which is the dilemma now for psychology and for society and for countries internationally. And what I'm interested in really is how these two systems interact with each other. Of course, once you start thinking like this, it raises issues about methods to reveal attitudes. And let's be clear, governments are still just looking at conscious attitudes, reflective attitudes, self-report attitudes. They're not trying to measure these implicit attitudes. Some methods may give misleading results. And it's this issue of psychological dissociation which might be the important thing. All kinds of interesting implications moving forward. How do the systems influence behaviour? How do they interact, if at all? How do you change the systems and how do you appeal to them? And I'll not go into details on this, but we've been doing work recently looking at how implicit attitude predicts choice of low-carbon products under time pressure. And we've also done work on eye movement, which is people with positive implicit attitudes in the environment are more likely to look at and fixate on climate change messages. Now that's one thing I'm interested in. I'm going to have to get a move on here. But the second thing I'm interested in is the same thing applied to ethnicity and race. Could there be some sort of dissociation here going on? Because if you look at changes in social attitudes towards ethnicity, the statistics are incredible. In the US, in 1942, only 35% said it was acceptable to have a black neighbour. It had changed to 64% in 1963. It was a dramatic change in a very short period. So what actually happened? Did it actually change, or did something more complicated happen? Now, the thing I'm interested in, again, is trying to move away from just what people say, and I'm interested in behaviour, and what I've been focusing on is employment. Because it looks as if there are all kinds of ethnic and racial biases when it comes to employment. Now, one way of demonstrating that is a very simple and sneaky process, where you get a CV and you attach two different photographs to it and two different names, and you simply send it out to real job applications. It's been done in many countries now, including the UK. So here's a study by Wood. Match CVs with white and non-white sounding names, sent to a range of, these are real jobs. And the black and minority ethnic candidates had to send 74% more applications than non-white to secure an interview. So there seems to be some sort of bias, but doesn't identify the bias or processes involved. Now, I tried to take this topic slightly closer to home because it looks as if universities are not immune to this. And when I started this line of research, it was 2009, 2010. And at that time, 11% of all white academics were professors, compared to 5% of BME academics. 50 black professors in the UK out of over 14,000. 0.35% of professors are black, but 2.8% of the population. And at that time, not a single black VC in the United Kingdom. So there was something. And the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education said that blacks in faculty ranks in the US will not reach parity with the black percentage of the overall American workforce for another 140 years. Now, most universities were trying to do something about this in terms of operational performance reviews, career development advice, mentoring, but there was still minimal change at senior level. So I was thinking, could there be some kind of implicit bias operating here, which people may not even be aware of? Now, in terms of this implicit bias, just let me say, psychologists have speculated at so many different levels where it comes from. There's some work from neuroscience saying that you get a different emotional response to out-group members versus own-group members, in terms of more response in the amygdala, which is connected with the processing of emotion. Allport himself talked about the psychological pull of the familiar. There's arguments that the implicit bias can be affected by early socialization experiences, and that it's significantly affected by our culture as a whole. So at every level, from the neuroscience to the cultural, there are arguments as to why it might be operating. But what are the implications of this implicit bias? What's the effects on behaviour? And that's where my work started. Now, the first thing I did when I started looking at this was I started off by looking at the kind of famous measure of implicit racial bias, which is on the Harvard site. And I didn't like the stimuli on this site because it's hard to determine what gender the people are. It's very close up. The faces look slightly threatening before you even start. So I thought, well, what happens if you change those images altogether and have nice smiling people, but from different ethnic backgrounds? Surely, if people like this were applying for jobs, surely there wouldn't be any ethnic bias whatsoever. I measured people's attitude towards people from different ethnic backgrounds using the traditional Likert scale, where people self-report. And then I did an IAT where people had to categorize faces as good or white, good or non-white, etc., etc. Exactly the same as before, trying to pick up implicit associations. When you do this test on the Likert score, you find, surprise, surprise, everybody's right in the middle. Everyone's a 3. They have no preference. That's what they report. When you do the implicit measure, you get something very different. The D-score, the average D-score was 0.73. Note, 0.8 is taken as a strong preference for white. So in our sample as a whole, there was approaching a strong sample for whites. The D-score of our white participants was 0.87, which was a strong preference for whites. Right, so that's so far so familiar. I just simply measured using an associative speed task. But the next bit was slightly more interesting. I came up with 2 genuine job adverts from a particular university. One was an academic position, the other an admin position. And what I wanted people to consider 4 CVs for each of the positions. And each of the CV contained some good bits and some bad bits, on the understanding that most people's CVs got some bits which are stronger than others. So there's some good bits and some bad bits. The bits in pink are not so good. They're not great journals. The bits below were great journals. So people had to read through the CVs, and then they were given a minute to make their decision. So they were shortlisting. They were given 4 candidates. They had to select 2. 2 of the candidates were white, 2 were black and minority ethnic. And what they didn't know was that the same CVs were constantly rotated. So they weren't different CVs, they were the same CVs. But no participant ever saw the same CV from 2 candidates. Does that make sense? They were rotated around the group. And what we then did was, we not only looked at their shortlisting decision, we analysed exactly where they fixated on the CV. Where did they look on the CV? Now this clip's not playing, but this is the kind of thing they did. You would see a little fly buzzing around that thing, and the red dots show the kind of fixations. You see they were very interested in this lady's headscarf. A lot of red dots in the headscarf means there was a lot of fixations there. Now this is the shortlisting decision. Now I find these results the strength of them quite surprising. Our white participants, 77% of the shortlisted candidates from the white participants were white. Now don't forget, these were the same CVs. They shortlisted, 77% of the people they shortlisted were white. 60% of the white participants shortlisted 2 white candidates. In fact, they were 10 times more likely to shortlist 2 white candidates than 2 black and minority ethnic candidates. The non-white participants also were not colourblind. 61% of the shortlisted candidates were non-white. But you'll see the difference here. 68% of the non-white participants chose 1 white and 1 non-white candidate. They tended to go for ethnic diversity, even though that wasn't implicit in the task. The whites tended to go for 2 whites. When you look at the Likert score, their attitude score of the people who shortlisted 2 whites or 2 non-whites, they were both a mean of 3. There was no difference. In other words, what they reported as their attitude didn't predict at all. But when you looked at their D-score, this is the implicit attitude of white participants. When they shortlisted 2 white applicants, their D-score was 1.17, which is very strong pro-white. Shortlisted 1 white and 1 non-white was 0.71, which was moderately pro-white. If they shortlisted 2 non-whites, which was rare, it was slightly pro-non-white. And that's the D-score of non-whites. You can see, funnily enough, that some non-whites obviously shortlisted 2 white candidates, and they had a strong implicit pro-white attitude. And again, the D-score seems to predict that. And if you also look at where they fixate on the CVs, the blue bars is the good bits of the information. The red dots is the bad information. And you can see that with white participants, they were more likely to look at the good information of white candidates rather than bad information, and the bad information from non-white candidates compared to good information. And just to, again, speed things up, the D-score seemed to predict the amount of fixation on good or bad information. Now, the reason to me that's interesting is that we all like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, and shortlisting people for jobs is a rational task. But what seems to be happening is our underlying implicit attitude affects what we fixate on when we're looking at people's CVs. So just before we make the final decision, if you've got an implicit bias towards white people, you're more likely to fixate on the good bits of their CV and therefore can report a rosier picture when you're coming to make your decision. Okay, if that makes sense. So the ethnicity of person making the judgment seems to influence who's shortlisted for academic posts, but not non-academic posts, the less high prestige non-academic posts. Self-reported attitude has no effect. Implicit attitude does seem to affect who's shortlisted. Strong pro-white bias, people with a strong pro-white bias spend more time looking at the good information of white candidates, and our implicit and unconscious attitude directs our unconscious eye movements when we consider their CVs. Our rational decisions about the suitability of candidates are based on this bias pattern of fixation, which to me is really interesting. This is how the systems interact. They interact partly by what we see when we look out there in the world. Okay, so the conclusions of all this. So, encouraging the green revolution. How do we get people to respond more to do with climate change? Well, we need to recognize that people have two minds, not one. We need to understand that many people have implicit and explicit attitudes that are dissociated. These different attitudes direct behaviour in different domains. And we need to find new ways of identifying these individuals moving away from self-reports. And I've had a chance recently to do an international study of explicit and implicit clashes in countries like Brazil, India, China, and the US. We need to understand how those with dissociated attitudes process incoming information. Because if people have attitudes, implicit and explicit attitudes, that are in conflict, there are certain kinds of messages they're not going to want to see. It's going to be a severe state of cognitive dissonance, and that's going to set up all kinds of interesting implications for processing of information. We need to find new ways of changing implicit attitudes in the area of sustainability. That's the big one. I'll just say a little bit in a few minutes on that. And we've now got ways of measuring them so we can see if they work. In terms of tackling implicit racism, we need to introduce System 2 thinking. We all know that it's ridiculous to make judgments about people's suitability for jobs on the basis of ethnic or racial background. So we need to interfere with this natural connection between implicit process and behaviour. In any shortlisting group, you must never ask for first thought for, I've been on committees where people have said, give me your first thoughts on the candidates. If we do that, we're going to be tapping the more automatic associations. And we need to interfere with the connection between unconscious and conscious behaviour. We need to translate the unconscious into conscious by using things like implementation intentions. If blah, 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 then we need to formulate things more explicitly. And we need to change contextual factors. But most importantly of all, the real take-home message from this work is we need to work on changing our implicit attitude in this domain by influencing our underlying associative networks. And why do I think that's possible? Well, because I read the smoking literature with admiration, because I cannot believe how an industry managed to get people to put cancerous sticks in their mouth. It is extraordinary. Of course, they had some of the best psychologists of the last 3 generations working for them to do that. But of course, if they can persuade people to do that, we can persuade people to do anything. But we need to think now. It's not enough just to get rational arguments about climate change out there, because that's not going to do the trick. We need to change these implicit systems, because it's the implicit system that's directing our behaviour in many domains. And my conclusion is if we can make people smoke, we can help them do anything. The title of the talk was The Divide Itself. And I think it gives us a metaphor for thinking about human beings and the challenges we face, because I think as a nation and as a world, we're facing major global challenges. But those challenges can only be met by us being more explicit about the very nature of human beings. We have an unconscious self. That unconscious self directs us to much of our everyday behaviour. That's what we need to work on.